All right, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 114. In our first lecture, we talked about the way in which the Civil War era has been represented in historiography and our broader public culture. Here today, we begin a series of lectures that will examine the first period under review in the class, the road to the Civil War. In our first few lectures, we're going to talk about why the Civil War begins in 1861, and to do that we need to back up to the decades prior to the Civil War and talk about the North and the South and the very different paths those two sections of the country are on and how that will lead to a divide over the issue of slavery. We begin that process here with a survey of the antebellum South. In this lecture we'll talk about the South. In the decades prior to the Civil War, we'll discuss the economy, culture, and society of the South. And then in our next lecture, we'll talk about the North and its very different economy, society, and culture as we start to develop this first section of the class, first third of the class, the road to the war. So let's do that here with our first lecture as we examine the antebellum South. Historians argue that if it wasn't for the invention of the cotton gin, and the transition from a tobacco-based slave economy to a cotton-based slave economy, perhaps southern states would have, like northern states, ended slavery and transitioned towards industrialization. But that's a counterfactual. That's not what happens. Instead, in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, at a point when the North is slowly transitioning towards a factory-based industrial economy, the South instead is becoming more committed than ever to slave-based agriculture. In 1791, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin and allows for the mass harvesting and production of cotton in a way never seen prior. And what this does is it allows the South to make that transition from a slave-based economy that had been previously focused on the cash crop of tobacco to now instead a slave-based agricultural economy centered on what was then described as white gold, cotton, a cash crop in demand around the globe. So, at a point when the North is ending slavery, transitioning from a farm-based rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy, the South is on a very different path. It is instead becoming more committed to slavery, as slavery shifts from a tobacco-based model to one centered on white gold, king cotton. In the decades leading up to the American Civil War, between 1840 to 1850, 1850 to 1860, cotton production in the South doubles each and every decade. So very clear evidence for us here that slavery, and in particular the cultivation of cotton through that labor system, is more important than ever to the South in the decades and years leading up to the American Civil War. On the eve of the American Civil War in 1860, the United States produced 75% of the global supply of cotton. We produced cotton that ultimately was sold to the world. And as we'll see later in the class, that will be very important in regards to the Civil War, and in particular the European response to the American Civil War. The fact that we were importing so much cotton to Great Britain and other nations will be important in so many of the key developments we'll see later on in the class. America produced 75% of the global supply of cotton. In the 19th century, other alternatives for material for clothing were rather objectionable. You can wear clothing made of wool from sheep, but that's itchy against the skin and miserable in hot weather. You could wear clothing made of silk, which feels wonderful against various parts of your skin, but is extremely expensive. Cotton was instead the preferred alternative. It was lightweight, breathable, good in warm weather and cold weather. I don't need an inventory of everything you're wearing right now, but chances are somewhere on your body you're wearing something made of cotton. It is, as Zoe Deschanel reminds us, the fabric of our lives. And so it was in demand around the globe, and America met that demand through the slave regime here in the United States in the decades leading up to the Civil War. On the eve of the Civil War, the most valuable commodity in America was its slave population, 4 million human beings held in bondage who were collectively worth $3.5 billion. In our first lecture, we talked about how today there is this widespread consensus, unanimity regarding the profitability of slavery, and it comes from these statistics that are now indisputable. The most valuable commodity in America was not to be found in the North, but instead in the South, in the form of human beings held in bondage who are collectively worth $3.5 billion. That figure you see on the screen is in $1860, not $2020. I think we can all agree that $3.5 billion in 2020 is still a lot of money. But that $3.5 billion figure you see here is not in 2020 dollars. It's in 1860 dollars. If you want to know what that means today, it's multiplied by 100. This gives you an idea how profitable slavery was and why 11 states will secede from the Union to preserve and expand slavery, to preserve and expand this great source of wealth. The 4 million slaves worth $3.5 billion, that is more than all the railroads, all the factories, all the banks in the North combined. Cotton was king, white gold. It produced the very first millionaires in American history. The first human beings in the United States who amassed over $1 million were not financiers, bankers, railroad magnates. They were slave owners in the South. So this begins our study of the road to the Civil War. This begins our study of this great divide between North and South. When the North is transitioning to an industrial, urban economy, the South is more committed than ever to this great source of profit that comes from slavery and the cultivation of cotton. One of the effects of the rise of the Cotton Kingdom was a shift in the locus of slavery in the South. In the colonial period, when the American slave economy centered on tobacco, the largest slave populations were found in tobacco-producing states in the Chesapeake region like Virginia and Maryland. But with the shift towards cotton came a transition in the slave population from those Chesapeake states to the Deep South, to states like Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, what was known as the Cotton Belt. So you have the shift in the demography of slavery, where slaves are being sold out of Chesapeake states like Virginia and into the Deep South, into Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. This changed the demography and locus of slavery as a result. Another effect of the Cotton Kingdom was the westward sprawl and advance of cotton, and this will be very important soon to our discussion of the road to the Civil War. As we'll soon see, the Civil War in many ways is about the West and the future of the West, the future of America unveiled in the West, and whether or not that future will be one open to slavery or closed to slavery. Southerners sought land in the West. They sought to expand this lucrative, profitable system of slavery so they could expand the Cotton Kingdom, and that too plays a role in the shifting demography and locus of slavery as it is not only moving to the Deep South but to the West, and that will, as we'll soon see in lectures to come, spark a great divide and debate regarding slavery in the West that will lead to the Civil War. So we begin our study of the antebellum South in this lecture with a quick summary of its economy. An economy that in the early 19th century is becoming more committed than ever to slavery, now with the cultivation of a cash crop of great profitability and demand around the globe. And this not only introduces you to the economy of the antebellum South, it is a good indication, again, as to why 11 states will secede from the Union to preserve and extend this system of great profit. Related to our discussion of the economy of the antebellum South is the way in which it is so divergent from economic trends that we'll soon talk about in our next lecture in the North. But let me just quickly summarize this divergence so that you can begin to appreciate and understand this growing schism, this growing cleavage between North and South that ultimately manifests in a civil war. The South and the North are on very different economic paths. As I summarized in the first slide, the South is becoming more committed to slavery. The North instead is transitioning, as we'll see, to an industrial urban economy. You don't have that in the South. There's very little industry, very few factories in the South. Less than 10% of all manufactured goods produced in the United States on the eve of the Civil War are produced south of the Mason-Dixon line. This will later be very consequential when we get to the war itself and the supply problems that the South will run into when the Civil War goes on and on and on, and issues of production and supply become really important. Towards the end of the Civil War, there weren't enough rifles for Confederate soldiers. In fact, Confederate soldiers were told in some of the battles in 1864, 1865, in the latter stage of the war, that if they wanted a rifle, they had to run into combat, kill a Northern soldier, and take his rifle. If that's how you're fighting a war, things aren't going well for you. So when the war goes much longer than expected, and the South faces the supply concerns that come with its limited manufacturing base, this ultimately will be very crucial to the defeat of the South. The South didn't invest in industry. Why invest in factories? Why invest in something new, unproven, when they had a guaranteed source of profit, the profits that came with owning slaves and cultivating tobacco? There are few, if any, large cities in the South, very little urbanization in the South. The only large city, only city that we could really describe as large in the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, was New Orleans. And that's an anomaly. It was an inherited city. We didn't found New Orleans. It was once under the dominion of the Spanish and the French. It ultimately was included in the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. So we inherited, not produced, that city. But moreover, it was a city that was largely focused on slavery. It wasn't a city like New York or Boston or Philadelphia that was centered on manufacturing. The only large city in the South, New Orleans, owed really its economic livelihood to slavery. I mentioned earlier that there's this demographic, geographic shift in slavery, moving from Chesapeake states like Virginia and Maryland to the Deep South, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. And so slaves are being sold out of Virginia into the Deep South, where they would be more profitable as a source of labor. And the heart, the center of that slave trade, that internal slave trade, where slaves are being sold from one state to another. I mentioned this briefly in our first lecture. That's another way in which slavery was profitable. Slavery was profitable not just for people who owned slaves and benefited directly from their farm labor, but slavery was profitable to people who speculated in slaves, bought slaves, sold slaves. It was profitable to shipbuilders who built the ships that transported slaves. The reaches of slavery are far, far. They reach well beyond the direct ownership of slaves. It's one of the reasons why we historians can assert that slavery is so profoundly at the center of so many developments in American history in this period. So you had the slave trade, and the center of that slave trade was New Orleans. New Orleans thrived and became a large city mostly because of the slave trade. It was the center of slave sales, large slave markets operated, selling slaves who were being often sold out of Chesapeake states into the new economy of the Deep South, the Cotton Kingdom. So New Orleans was the only large city, and it was only a large city in part because of slavery. One of the forces in the North, that's the reason why cities are growing in such size, immigration. One reason that cities are growing is an internal migration in the North, where people are leaving rural areas to go to New York, Philadelphia, Boston to work. But another factor was large-scale immigration from Europe. There's very little immigration in the South. Immigrants came to cities to work in factories. So another element of the lack of urbanization in the South is that there was little immigration, and then a consequence of that is there's very little sense of change, very few outsiders. It really made the South increasingly a closed society, so defined through slavery. Most slave speculation investment was funded by northern banks. Most of the banking system, going back to the colonial period, was centered in New England states. If you have a credit card, as I imagine you do, as you're a living human being in the 21st century, when you mail off, or if you mail off your payments, they go to places like New Hampshire, Delaware, those small states in New England, which remain to this day the heart of the American banking industry. Banks in the North speculated in new things like industrialization, railroads, but they also helped to really fund and fuel the slave economy. Whatever banks exist in the South almost exclusively served plantations and the speculation and commerce that came with slavery. What this meant was that there's very little innovation again in the South, very little investment in new things like factories and railroads. And that, of course, has an economic consequence in maintaining an economy so centered on slavery. Again, Southerners were disinclined to speculate in something new, something unproven, like a factory system or railroads, because they had a guaranteed source of profit in slavery. Why invest in something weird, new, dislocating like factories when you've got a great and dedicated, known source of wealth in slavery? Own slaves, grow cotton, and reap the profits. But one of the consequences of that was little innovation, little experimentation, few railroads, few factories. And again, that will have consequence later in the course of the Civil War, help explain why the South ultimately is defeated, because it doesn't have enough factories to satisfy its supply demands. But as we'll talk about here in this lecture and in many lectures to come, another factor in the lack of economic innovation and investment in new things was cultural, where the South remained so traditional, unchanging, and came to see a conservative ethic of keeping things the way they are as something to value. So the North and the South, very different economic paths. The North is industrializing, urbanizing, awash in dramatic changes, new technologies, seeing large-scale migration. Wherever you looked in the North, as we'll soon see in our next lecture, there was these profound markers of change. The South, very different, doubling down upon, recommitting to slave-based agriculture. And as a result, we historians argue that by the 1830s, the antebellum South was a slave society. And that's a very precise term and one that we want to make sure we understand. A slave society is not a society with slaves or a society with slavery, where slavery is part of that society. It's its major labor source or major focus of its economy. Instead, a slave society is one in which every aspect of life for every member of that society is defined through slavery. Slavery sets the value system of that society. Slavery establishes notions of right and wrong for that society. That's what I mean by a slave society. A slave society is a very precise idea and term. It is one in which every aspect of life for every member, whether they own slaves or not, whether they are enslaved or not, every member is defined through slavery. Their identity, their sense of self, as we'll talk about here in this lecture, even their notion of freedom is defined through slavery. So that is a slave society, one in which every aspect of life for every member of that society is defined through slavery. Not a society with slaves, a slave society. And we can begin to understand this when we look to the fact that the vast majority of whites in the antebellum South did not own slaves and really had no reasonable expectation of ever owning slaves. Here we arrive at a very important fact, insight, in regards to the Civil War. The vast majority of Confederate soldiers who fight and die in the Civil War do not own slaves and really had no reasonable expectation of owning a slave. Slaves were expensive because they were such a source of profit. On the eve of the Civil War, a young male slave in the South would command a price of around $1,000, which is far outside the reach of most dirt farmers, subsistence farmers in the South. And yet it will be those very people, poor non-slaveholding whites, who will fill the ranks of the Confederate Army and fight and die for the right of other white men to own slaves. That doesn't make sense if you approach that historical fact, that historical phenomenon, through economics. People fighting for a system that they don't directly economically benefit from. The only way to make sense of that historical fact is through culture and society. Cultural and societal values of a slave society that urge non-slaveholding whites to think of who they are, what they value, what it means to be free through slavery, even if they did not own slaves, even if they did not directly, materially benefit from slaves. So this really centers on our idea here in this slide of a slave society, where most whites don't own slaves, have no reasonable expectation of ever owning a slave, but they feel in league with, in solidarity with, the few who do own slaves, to such an extent that they're willing to fight and die for the right of those few to own slaves. The vast majority of soldiers who fight for the Confederate Army don't own slaves, but they fight to preserve and extend slavery because they share a common value system through the slave society with the slaveholders of the South. Our image of the antebellum South, informed by cultural texts like Gone with the Wind, is of a planter in a Gothic mansion gazing across thousands of acres of land, hundreds of slaves. That might be the dominant image we conjure up of the antebellum South, but that's really the exception. The planter class, those who owned hundreds of slaves, those who owned huge plantations, are few in number. They're an important exception because of the great power brokers in the Southern economy, in Southern politics. They dominated politics, and in many ways in terms of national politics. It is telling and revealing that prior to the Civil War, all of our presidents, except for two, were slaveholders from the South. So the exception, the planter class, who was few in number, are important because though they were the exception, though they are few in number, they dominated Southern politics and arguably national politics. But they are few in number. That's not the common experience in the South. And yet, the poor subsistence farmers thought of themselves in solidarity with, in league with, in commonality with that planter elite to such an extent that they're willing to fight and die for the right of those planters to own slaves. Most whites in the South don't own slaves. The few who did only owned 2 or 3 slaves, not a huge population of slaves. And yet, there are these common values, a cultural glue that develops in the antebellum South that urges all white men, whether they own slaves or not, to feel a sense of solidarity with those planters. What served as this cultural glue? Well, we have it here listed in one of the bullet points. 1, racism. That's pretty obvious, and it's so obvious and necessary to slavery, you might be apt to dismiss it. But you do so at your peril, because racism functioned in a very important and profound way in this slave society. Racism is the idea that whites are inherently, biologically, ontologically superior to non-whites. And what that does is it elevates all white men to the same plane. Has nothing to do with class, has nothing to do with wealth. It says because of the color of your skin, because of a biological trait that you, a poor white man, share with a rich white man, you're all the same, you're all equal. in that status of superiority, in that status at the top of a racial hierarchy. So racism is a great social and economic leveler. It convinces you that you are equal with all white men as you share that common race, that common skin color. So though it's obvious to say racism was a key value in the South that undergirded and supported slavery, that slavery needed racist ways of thinking, it's also important to see racism in this role as a binding agent, as a cultural glue that could urge poor white men to see themselves as equals to rich white men. We're all white men, and there's something exceptional and important about being a white man in a society that prizes white supremacy and white superiority. Another element of the cultural glue, regional loyalty, this idea that being a Southerner is important, unique, worth honoring. This notion of a Southern identity, a Southern uniqueness, a regional identity becomes sharper and sharper as the North and the South do indeed diverge in key ways, as the North becomes so different than the South. When Southerners looked up north, they saw factories and immigrants and cities, and they became more and more aware of how they were different than the North. And Southerners argue that's important, that we're different. There's something good and unique about being Southern, and we should prize that. And that played a key role in, again, binding together all white men in a common identity. That regional loyalty has nothing to do with wealth. Every white man in the South could prize who they are, what they value in relation to this notion of being Southern, and share that. So it's another thing that, like racism, short circuits class divisions and urges a sense of commonality, solidarity, even equality among slaveholding and non-slaveholding. Honor. Honor is a key principle in the South, this idea of tradition, family name, a sense of manliness associated with honor. And white men in the South were urged to prize that idea. And again, that too has nothing to do with class, nothing to do with whether you own a slave or not. All white men in the South could be committed to that notion of honor, tradition, family name, lineage. Finally, paternalism. We're going to talk more about paternalism in the next slide because it's such a key concept. It is so illustrative of a cultural value that urged white men to see themselves in league. But in short, paternalism is the idea that as the family is governed, so should society. That the family is a model of society. That family and the family structure is the way in which all things, all social relations should be organized, including politics and society. In paternalism, you have this belief that in the family, you have a model for society. In a family, a paternal figure, a patriarch, a father, is in charge. He's at the top of a hierarchy above his wife, his children, and in slaveholding families, the enslaved. At the top of that hierarchy, he has all the responsibilities to care for women, children, and slaves who are imagined in this way of thinking as being his dependents. They are dependent upon him. Notice the term. It means they can never be independent, free. Paternalism believes that women cannot be independent. They need men. Children can't be independent. They need a paternal figure. And paternalism argued, of course, slaves can never be free and independent because they too are childlike or lazy or ignorant and unschooled. Again, these are all overlapping concepts. Of course, paternalism was deeply influenced by racism. Racism influences everything it touches. So paternalism is this idea that men are in charge in a family, and so should be in charge in society. As they are in charge, they take care of their dependents. They have all the responsibilities that go with being at the top of the social and familial hierarchy. But as a result of that, they have as well all the privileges and powers that come with their position, including the power to own other human beings. So paternalism is this idea of hierarchy. This is a key point to keep in mind as we go forward. Southerners don't believe in equality. They don't believe in phrases like all men are created equal, though that phrase was written by a slaveholder from the South. They don't believe in that idea of a universal equality or universal humanity or transcendent equality. Southerners on the eve of the Civil War, through the Civil War, and after the Civil War believe in hierarchy. The best way to organize society is some above others. The people at the top, white men, because they're white men. As they're at the top, they have all the responsibilities that go with their position, caring for their dependents, people who can never be independent, but they also get all the privileges, rights that go along with their status. Everything I've just said for the last, 2 or 3 minutes as I've described paternalism has nothing to do with class, has nothing to do with wealth. Paternalism was an ethic rooted in race and gender. It was an idea of white male supremacy. And because of that, all white men, whether they owned slaves or not, whether they were rich or poor, could stylize their existence, create an identity for themselves in relation to this way of thinking that prized white male supremacy. It is a key ethic that, again, spans all white men in the South, binds them together, and with it, you can start to understand that strange historical anomaly, why so many poor white men in the South who don't own slaves will fight for the right of other white men to own slaves. So again, slave society, one in which values, ethics, our sense of how to order society, what is right and wrong for all members of society, influenced through the institution of slavery. Now, there are some instrumental ways, material ways, that non-slaveholding whites directly benefited from slavery. You may not be able to own a slave, but sometimes you rented a slave. Sometimes non-slaveholding whites would rent a slave. If they needed a few extra hands at a time of harvest, they would rent a slave from a planter. And so there's a very instrumental way in which you might benefit from slavery, even if you did not own a slave. You had the power to rent a slave. Another instrumental benefit, material benefit for non-slaveholding whites came in the effort to hunt down runaway slaves and collect bounties as a result. Later in this lecture, we'll talk about slave resistance. Throughout the class, we'll talk about slave resistance and the way in which enslaved people insisted upon their freedom and often ran away, seeking that freedom. Well, when a slave ran away, it wasn't the wealthy millionaire planter who got on his horse in the middle of the night with a lantern and hunted down his runaway slaves. He called out a local posse of poor, non-slaveholding whites to do that duty, and if they captured the slave, they would get a bounty, a reward. So that's another way in which you could materially benefit from slavery, even if you did not own a slave. But really, what's binding together non-slaveholding whites and the slaveholding elite isn't these instrumental or material benefits. It's more philosophical. It's more in terms of values and identity, that slave society, and the most important identity that slavery defined for the slave society, the most important cultural value that slavery defined for all members of the society was freedom, liberty. Now, this is really hard to get your mind around. This is a real challenge for you here early in the class, but it's crucial that you do this difficult intellectual labor. Southerners could not conceive of, could not imagine liberty without slavery. We tend to think of slavery and freedom as polarities, as opposites. You don't get further from freedom than slavery. But that's not how Southerners thought. For them, rather than opposites and polarities, they were two sides of the same coin, meaning you needed slavery to define freedom. I know that's hard to think about. It's hard to compute. It is so anathema to our 21st century sensibilities where we're inclined to see freedom and slavery as opposites. But to understand the mode of thinking of the antebellum South and why so many non-slaveholding whites would fill the ranks of the Confederate Army, die in the hundreds of thousands for the right of other white men to own slaves, you have to get out of a 21st century way of thinking and strive to understand an antebellum way of thinking in the South where freedom defined slavery. When Southern men volunteer and fight and die for the Confederacy, when they consciously fight to preserve and extend slavery, in their mind, they are fighting for freedom. I know it's hard to make sense of, it's hard to compute, but it's right there in their diaries, their letters, their reminiscences. It's right there in the writs of secession. When Southern states secede from the Union, they say explicitly, we're doing this about slavery. It took a lot of labor, it took a lot of work, as we talked about in our first lecture, to hide that, to occlude that in the Dunning and Phillips school, to say, no, it's not about slavery, right? The reason why it took so much labor is because it was very obvious. It was just noted explicitly in the writs of secession signed by seceding states where they say, we're doing this to preserve and extend slavery. When Southern states secede to preserve and extend slavery, in their mind, they're doing it in the name of freedom. When Southerners fight to preserve and extend slavery, they're, in their mind, doing it to preserve freedom. We tend to think of the Civil War as one side fighting for oppression and one fighting for freedom. The South fighting for oppression, the North fighting for freedom. But that's not how Southerners thought of themselves. They didn't march in a battle every day and say, we're the oppressors of history, we're the great assholes of history. Instead, they thought they were fighting for freedom, a freedom that was informed by slavery. How? Well, slavery defined freedom, this key ethic, this key value in the antebellum South, in two ways. One, it defined the category of those who deserve to be free. Again, Southerners do not believe in universal equality. They do not believe everyone is equal. They believe in hierarchy. Only a few deserve power. Only a few deserve rights. Only a few deserve freedom. Who does? White men, because they're white men. It's that, again, racial hierarchy. So freedom defined the category of those who deserve to be free. Not everyone deserves to be free. Women, children, and slaves. Only white men deserve to be free. That's one way that slavery defined freedom for all white men. The other way was, well, one of the freedoms you enjoy as a white man is to own other people and profit from their labor. And as we've already documented in this lecture, those profits were immense. And when you are enjoying the profits of someone else's labor, someone who you're convinced doesn't deserve to be free and enjoy the fruits of their own labor, when you're enjoying those immense profits, boy, do you feel free. Boy, do you feel liberated. Boy, do you feel in charge of your destiny. So the other way that slavery defined freedom was it gave people a sense of the freedom that comes from the profiting of others. So we have this concept of a slave society, not a society with slaves, where key values, ethics, identities, who you are, what you value, what does it mean to be free, informed through slavery. As I mentioned, we're going to cover paternalism here in greater depth. Remember, paternalism is that element of a slave society that argues as the family is governed, so should society. It is very demonstrative of the point I'm making throughout this lecture, and will really make throughout the class, the way in which hierarchy is prized in the South. Keeping things the way they are, centering things with white men at the top of a social structure. When Northerners are embracing ideas of social mobility, rising from rags to riches, your birthright and background mean nothing, Southerners are instead invested in this idea of hierarchy, keeping things the way they are, locking people into social positions that are immutable, unchanging, a function of immutable and unchanging characteristics like skin color. So paternalism is this idea that the hierarchy of the family is a model for a hierarchy in society. The top of that hierarchy, white men, who are in that position, who deserve that hierarchical position because they're white men, because of their race and gender. And as a result, they have certain power, like to own other people. That's paternalism. Now, again, this has nothing to do with class, nothing to do with wealth. Whether you are a slaveholder or not, you could be invested in this notion of power, privilege, social standing that comes with not class and wealth, but race and gender. The position of white men in this role is a function of, again, being white men. This means that every white man in the South could think of who they are in this way, through paternalism. And that's why it's such a key cultural value, cultural glue that helps us understand why so many white men would fight to preserve slavery, because this way of thinking that was necessary to slavery, that cast non-white men into this position as being dependents under the control of others was a way of thinking about all white men, whether they owned slaves or not, and their standing at the top of a hierarchy. Because of the value placed on paternalism, hierarchy, social standing, preserving a certain hierarchy in society, this is why concepts of honor, family name, reputation are so common in the antebellum South. It's why duels are so common, when if you offend someone's family name or heritage or manliness, could lead to violence. In northern states, in the early 19th century, as northern states transitioned towards industrialization, urbanization, towards a embrace of social mobility, rising from rags to riches, invent a machine and you could become rich and famous and well known. Southerners instead are invested in this idea of conservatism, keeping things the way they are. And they're very suspicious of change, of social mobility, of people moving up and down social ranks. And that's why, again, duels are very common. Concepts of looking backward to the past, family name and lineage are so common. Duels are dying out in the North because they're embracing this idea of the self-made man rising from rags to riches. It doesn't matter your background, your birthright, your reputation, your family name. If you work hard, show up on time, the world is yours. Southerners at the same time are embracing keeping things the way they are. Hierarchy, paternalism. All of this, again, crucial to developing a common white male solidarity that spans class, that yokes together all white men, that short circuits class divides, that provides this cultural glue, tells you who you are, what you value, who you are in league with as a function of, again, skin color and gender. One last note about paternalism in regards to how it defined a certain notion of femininity. Paternalism, of course, certainly was an ethic in regards to male privilege and male power, but complementing that was a vision of womanhood that also is vital to providing support for a slave society and a slave regime. Paternalism, again, is the idea of white men in charge as masters of their dependents, and dependents included children, enslaved people who are imagined to be childlike and immature in relation to the abiding racism of this period. But it also saw women as dependents below men in that hierarchy. So paternalism not only defined a sense of masculinity and maleness, but also femininity, that women were below men, that women were weak, that women were dependent on man. And that served to support slavery, one, in the sense that because women were considered weak, they should be protected by the paternal figure. They should be excused from hard labor as a result of their fragility and weakness as dependents. Well, if you want to excuse your wife from the drudgery of farm labor because you imagine her as weak as a dependent, how do you get the farm labor done? Who does the farm labor in the stead of your wife? Slaves. So one way in which notions of womanhood and femininity that come with paternalism, women as weak and dependent on men, that helped to build support for slavery was that white men in the South could think of themselves as good paternal figures who protected their wives from having to do work if they could have slaves do the labor. So you could think of yourself as a good husband, a good father, a good paternal figure if you owned slaves, and in doing so excused your wife from doing the drudgery of labor. It was a way of stylizing your existence as a man that made you deeply invested in the slave economy, slave values, and slave system. Another key factor here was, in regards to seeing women as weak independents, was that it often urged non-slaveholding whites to be fierce defenders of slavery because they were, again, encouraged to see themselves as the protectors of their dependents, the protectors of women in their lives. And therefore, they had to protect women from free black men. There was this belief, and it remains in many ways to this day, in the antebellum South that black men could never be free. They must always be enslaved because they are inherently sexual, carnal, and libidinous. And if they ever were free, they would rape your white wife or white daughter. And so seeing black men in that racist way urged white men to want to protect their vulnerable white wives, their weak, dependent white wives, and therefore they would get on their horses and hunt down runaway slaves. They would see black men as sources of peril and danger, and therefore be deeply invested in maintaining black men in chains and bondage. So there's a lot of ways in which paternalism defined a certain notion of women, as much as it defined a sense of men. Women as weak, as dependents, and that too led to support for the slave society, even among white men who did not own slaves. In many lectures to come, we're going to encounter some anti-slavery arguments emanating from the North. In fact, we're going to examine two very different, distinct arguments that emerged in the North opposed to slavery. When these arguments develop in the North, the South counters with its own pro-slavery arguments, which we'll walk through in this slide. And so part of what you'll learn about in the slide is how Southerners defended slavery in jousting with, in contesting with the anti-slavery arguments that are emanating from the North. But also in the slide, when we encounter these pro-slavery arguments, we're encountering the values of that slave society, because when they argued for slavery, when they advanced these pro-slavery arguments, they weren't just jousting with, contesting with the anti-slavery arguments in the North. They were revealing their values, their priorities. When they defended slavery, they were revealing what they believed to be good, right, and just. I talked a lot about paternalism and racism already, so I don't feel obliged to say much more other than to acknowledge that they are crucial and complex defenses of slavery. Another pro-slavery argument was the conservative argument. As I've mentioned now many times, as we'll demonstrate in our next lecture, the North is awash in change in the early 19th century. It is industrializing. It is urbanizing. It is seeing all kinds of new inventions. We're blowing up mountains and sending railroads right through them. We're diverting the course of rivers and building canals. Immigrants are coming from around the world. You see social movements like feminism, abolitionism, all sorts of reform movements, a great religious awakening occurring. Wherever you look in the North, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, change. And Southerners look up north and they see that as bad, as pernicious. We are often inclined to see change as good, that simply change itself is good. That's not how Southerners think. They believe in keeping things the way they are. They're invested in hierarchy, looking backward, family name. This is the conservative argument for slavery. Things are the way they are for a reason, and you shouldn't change them with new, novel ways of thinking. That erodes an existing order that has evolved in a certain way for very important reasons. So Southerners are very suspicious of change. They don't see change as good. In fact, they see change as bad, noxious, corrosive. They want to keep things the way they are. They argue that over time, a slave economy and a society has evolved in the South for reasons. And we should not mess around with those reasons. We should not tamper with that. Keep things the way they are. Southerners argue that slavery is good, natural, just, the proper way of organizing society. Again, hierarchy, paternalism. This too is really hard for us to get our minds around, but it's absolutely true. Absolutely demonstrated in the historical record. Southerners, leading to the Civil War, will argue that their society is the most advanced, just society on earth. I know, it's really hard for us to accept. We tend to think of the antebellum South, the slave society of the South, as backward, immoral, retrograde. But that, again, is not how Southerners thought of themselves. They didn't walk around every day saying, we're the backward, retrograde people of American history. People like George Fitzhugh, a sociologist, scholar in the South, one of the very first men to actually use the term sociology, one of the founders of that science, argued that Southern society in the 1850s is the most advanced on earth, that is a model for others. That really gives you a sense of that slave society and how Southerners believed. They said, our society is a model for others. Everyone should order their society, again, in the way in which we've ordered our society. New things, new ideas, the equality of the races, the equality of the sexes. Southerners say that is corrosive to what they see as the proper order. Another argument that reveals, in this case, the morality, we could say, at least the moral sense of the South. And another argument that's really hard for us to get our mind around in our 21st century mentality that Southerners used to defend slavery was the positive good argument. This was the idea that slavery is good. When you have an abolitionist movement in the North, which we'll talk about in our next lecture, that argues slavery is evil, slavery is inherently evil, Southerners say, no, slavery's good. They argue slavery's been good for the South. It's been this great source of wealth and productivity. They argue slavery's been good for the United States. It's what's turned a fledgling enterprise of 13 states into a wealthy, prosperous nation. Again, slavery was profitable not just for slave owners, banks in the North, shipping companies in the North, insurance companies that sold insurance on both slaves and the transportation of slaves, all profited from slavery. And Southerners were more than willing to point that out. So another element of the positive good argument was slavery's been good for the United States. But the positive good argument also asserted that slavery has been good not just for the South, not just for the United States, but for the slaves themselves. Yeah, that's what makes it so hard for us to get our mind around. This was rooted in the abiding racism of this period. It said, look, we took these people from Africa, where they would have just killed each other, and brought them here to America, and taught them English, taught them Christianity, and made them profitable, productive people. Again, it's very difficult for us to hear this, very difficult for us to get our mind around, but this is how Southerners believed. They believed slavery was good, moral, and just. Related to this was the biblical argument. Slavery's in the Bible. How could slavery be wrong? How can slavery be evil? Look at the Bible. It's chock full with admonitions from God regarding how to treat your slave. God says in the Bible, treat your slave like this and not like this. Well, that seems to indicate God's cool with slavery. The Bible has often been used to justify slavery and certainly was a key source of justification for Southerners as they made this argument for the morality of slavery. There's the historical argument. Great societies in history were rooted in slavery. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the very civilizations that gave us Western civilization. The Greeks gave us democracy. The Romans gave us a republican form of government. If slavery is bad, how would these great civilizations develop, thrive, and give us these elements of Western culture? Now, as we know, as we should acknowledge, slavery in the ancient world very different than the race-based for life chattel slavery of the South, but that distinction, important to be mindful of as historians, was very selectively elided by this historical argument. Admittedly, some of these arguments are a little out there, ethereal, philosophical, right? They do demand some mental gymnastics. But if those more ethereal, philosophical arguments don't convince you, Southerners always had one last card to play. One last card that they could play that for them silenced the debate regarding slavery. Private property. They made an argument that, well, slaves are private property, and therefore the government should have no right to intervene on what is simply a matter of private property. Slaves are no different under law than a mule, a rake, a wagon. Can't tell me what I can do with my mule, rake, or wagon. Why should you be able to tell me what to do with my slave? So this was always the last card to play, the base, the foundation. For Southerners, the inarguable defense of slavery It's simply a matter of private property, and they made that argument in a country where private property is sacrosanct. You want to talk about the real religion in America? What's our real religion in this country? It's real estate, man. We worship at the altar of private property. I mean, we have a cable channel in this country dedicated to watching people buy a house and then turn around and sell that house as if that's entertainment. That's how we spend our weekends, staring at someone buy a house. That really speaks to an American culture that does worship property values, private property, real estate, HGTV. Tune in this week to watch me go from rich to really fucking rich, right? Like it's entertainment. So when Southerners make this argument, they're tapping into that deep American core that so prizes private property, that sees private property as religious, as sacrosanct. I mean, this country was born out of private property. No taxation without representation. So for Southerners, this ends the debate. They were going to draw on that deep well of American respect, almost religious adoration for the righteousness of private property. Here we have in the slide a number of pro-slavery arguments that, again, don't just tell us how Southerners defended slavery, but also demonstrate that in that defense they were revealing what they thought was good, moral, and ultimately just, the best way to organize society. Let's continue here by just quickly reiterating a key point about values and culture. Though it's really hard for us to get our mind around, it is absolutely historically true. Southerners tended to think of freedom in relation and defined through slavery rather than as the opposite of slavery in two key ways. Slavery defined the category of those who deserve to be free. As I've stressed throughout this lecture, Southerners do not believe in universal freedom. They do not believe in Lockean notions that we're all born in a state of nature with natural rights. They do not believe in that phrase from the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. They believe some are superior to others. Only white men should be free. They should be free from wage earning, which Southerners saw as a form of wage slavery, where white men are dependent rather than independent, dependent on selling their time for money, dependent on whether or not a boss may hire them. Instead, they should be independent. And what makes them free? The right to own those who are imagined never to be free. Slavery defines the category of those who deserve to be free, white men, and allows them to profit off the labor of those who will be forever dependent. On the eve of the Civil War, the largest circulating newspaper in what will briefly be the capital of the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, the Richmond Enquirer, made it very clear. It stated simply, succinctly, freedom is not possible without slavery. When we read that today, we go, blah, 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 right? It doesn't make sense. It causes dissonance in our mind. They're telling us that the sky is green, up is down, black is white. But when the Richmond Enquirer published that sentence, and when Southerners read it, they just shrugged their shoulders, of course. It's like telling them the sky is blue. So, though it's hard for us to get our mind around, for Southerners, slavery defined freedom. And that's why Southerners thought they were on the right side of history in the Civil War. The Civil War we tend to think of as a story of one side fighting against freedom, the South fighting for slavery, and the North fighting for freedom. But Southerners didn't see themselves in that way. They thought they were fighting for freedom, a freedom that for them could only be defined through slavery. It's very demonstrative here of how the slave economy defined values, in this case, the most crucial value in America, the value of freedom. In this lecture, I have been stressing to you for some time now this idea of a slave society. It's a very crucial but complicated insight. That by the 1830s, the South is not a society with slaves, where slavery is a part of that society, it's just another element of that society. Instead, by the 1830s, the South is a slave society, where every aspect of life for all of its members is informed and defined through slavery. So far, I've been making that point in regards to whites in the South, how all whites, whether they own slaves or not, came to understand who they are, what they value in relation to slavery. But if it's truly a slave society where everyone, every human being, came to understand who they are and what they value through slavery, there's one group that I have failed to yet include in the slave society: the slaves themselves. And so now we turn our attention in this lecture to filling that hole, filling that lacuna. Because for these human beings, for these Southerners, when you hear the term Southerner, it's always racialized. Even today, you think of only white people. Guess what? There are millions and millions of African Americans in the South, and somehow they remain invisible when we think of the South or the Southerners. And in this period, there are millions of people in the South, African Americans, who are enslaved. But they too came to understand who they are, what they value, and most crucially, what it means to be free through slavery. So we do turn our attention now to that missing element. And I seek to document here how they too, the enslaved, African Americans, slaves themselves, are part of the slave society, how they too came to understand who they are, their identity, what they value, and what it means to be free, in this case, through the experience of being enslaved. And that is most vibrant, most accessible to us through slave resistance. We're now going to talk for some time about resistance to slavery and how slaves resisted. And when they did resist slavery in a variety of ways, they were expressing their identity and their claim to freedom. This is how, for even the enslaved, they come to understand who they are, what they value, and what it means to be free through slavery. When they resisted slavery, they were saying, I'm a human being with a soul, subjectivity. And that was a resistance to chattel slavery, the form of slavery we've learned about in this class that's all about dehumanization. When they ran away, when they attempted to be free individuals, they too were making a claim to freedom that came out of their experience of being enslaved. So when we use this concept of slave society, we mean it, we historians, because yes, every member of Southern society came to understand who they are, what they value, what it means to be free through slavery. In this case, that's also true for the enslaved. And it's really easy to see that when you turn your attention to slave resistance, where they are expressing their identity, their sense of values, what they believe is right and wrong, and ultimately their claims to freedom. Now, in a moment, we'll talk about some very, very obvious, overt forms of resistance. Slaves running away, seeking to emancipate themselves. We'll talk about rebellions on ships. We'll talk about Nat Turner in 1831 grabbing farm equipment and marching from plantation to plantation, hacking to death every white person he encounters. I don't have to work too hard to convince you that's resistance, armed rebellion, running away. But most slaves don't engage in such acts of rebellion for reasons we'll also talk about in a moment. But that doesn't mean they're not resisting slavery. It doesn't mean they're not making a claim to their humanity and some very limited modicum of freedom. To truly understand slave resistance, we have to look beyond the obvious and overt forms of resistance and see it in slave family life, in slave religiosity. When slaves formed families, they were saying, I am a human being and I want to live in this very human way. I want to have some control over the most intimate aspects of my life, who I love, the children I raise. If chattel slavery is about dehumanization, if chattel slavery as we've defined it, the uniquely American form of slavery, is all about denying the humanity of human beings, forming a family and asserting oneself as a human, living in a very human way of your own volition and creation, this doesn't change your status. You're still a slave. You'll die a slave. But forming a family in that way is a challenge to that idea of chattel slavery. When slaves embraced religion, thought of themselves as having free will, accountable to God, when they were also enlivened and awakened by that second great awakening, that moment of great religious enthusiasm, they were urged to see themselves as having a soul, a subjectivity, being children of God, not pieces of property. So yeah, in a moment we'll talk about very overt forms of resistance, rebellion, runaway, and that clearly demonstrates how enslaved people made a claim to freedom by running away, by leading rebellions. But even when they formed families, even when they embraced their religion and were enlivened by the Second Great Awakening, they were resisting slavery, and in doing so, coming to understand who they are, what they value, and what it means to be free through the institution of slavery as part of this slave society. Most slaves married, and most married for life, and raised their own children. For a long time, we historians were under a misconception about this element of American history. Up until the 1980s, really, most historians, most textbooks on U.S. history argued that slavery was so cruel, so abusive, that it was impossible for slaves to raise families and live in this very human way, forming their own families. But a lot of new insights and research came out in the 1980s, and that's changed our understanding of this aspect of American history, so that today we can clearly argue and demonstrate with evidence that indeed most slaves married, most married for life, and most raised their own biological children. Now, those marriages weren't legal. They didn't have any legal standing by any means. But in defiance of the way in which they were denied such rights, enslaved people formed these relationships. This is the point I'm making here about how the experience of being a slave denied any rights, any control over oneself. Slaves responded to that in an effort to try to have some, in this case, control over their lives. This again doesn't change their status. They're still slaves. They are born into slavery. They die slaves. If you form such a family, it made it less likely you would engage in more overt forms of resistance like running away, because if you ran away as a slave and were caught, one way you could be punished is to be sold away from your wives, children, members of your family. So again, this isn't that form of resistance, but it is a form of resistance, because what's happening here when enslaved people form families in defiance of chattel slavery, in defiance of the way in which they are not secured any rights, they're still attempting to live a life of their own making by forming these bonds of affection, by living in this very human way amidst a dehumanizing regime. However, slave families tend to be a little bit different than comparable free white families of this period in being a little bit more female-centered, and this is because of the constant fear of disruption through sales, that at any moment the family created by the enslaved people could be separated by a member of the family being sold away, most likely the father or husband figure, because if a slave owner needed money because the cotton crop didn't come in as he anticipated, or he's in deep in debt, or lost a lot of money in a card game or something, it would be the male slaves who would be sold first because they were so valuable and would fetch the highest price. And as a result, the wives, the mothers of these families, had to be ready to step in as sole parents. So actually, if you look at the structure of enslaved people's families, they offered more autonomy, more say for women than comparable free white families, where the idea of the patriarch, the father being sold away, wasn't a possibility. But women had to be ready to step into that role and be sole parents and guardians of their children. So most slaves married, most married for life. They demonstrate the resistance to slavery and trying to live in this very human way, have some very, very, very limited freedom, control over your life by forming such a network of kinship. But the families of enslaved people tended to be a little bit different than the comparable free white families of this period, in being more female-centered and in relying on a wider network of kinship, aunts, uncles, cousins, who again could step into the role as parent if one of the parents was sold away. Also, enslaved people tended to rely on fictive kin people that you called your aunt or uncle but were not by blood, but played that role. Maybe you have this in your own family, right? You know, your own aunts and uncles really aren't that great. So over time, your mother and father developed other aunts or uncles, friends that you called aunts or uncles, and they played that role in your life. They maybe still play that role in your life. They're not related to you by blood. The term for that is fictive kin, and enslaved people relied on that in order to create greater security for their families when they had no security. And what's really remarkable here is that without that security, without the freedom to live as free individuals, enslaved people still aspired to live in this very human way and have some freedom over the most human and intimate aspects of their life. Another way in which enslaved people expressed their identity, their goals, aspirations, and made claims to certain visions of freedom in the slave society we are so describing in this lecture was through religion. In the early 19th century, the United States is awash in a moment of great religious excitement and enthusiasm, an event known as the Second Great Awakening. There are 4 moments in our history of great religious enthusiasm and excitement. There's the First Great Awakening, which began in the decades prior to the American Revolution in the early and mid-1700s. There is the Second Great Awakening, which we are describing now. Later in American history, there's a massive religious revival in the 1920s in the aftermath of World War I and the tumult of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And then the 4th moment of great religious enthusiasm and excitement begins in the 1970s with the rise of born-again Christianity, evangelical Christians, the cultural conservative movement. So the Second Great Awakening is one of these moments. There are 4 in the totality of American history where there's this great enthusiasm for religion, and a religious enthusiasm spreads across the nation like wildfire. Now, as we'll talk about in lectures to come, the Second Great Awakening is very causal, very important in the origins of abolitionism, one of those 2 arguments that we will encounter opposed to slavery. But the Second Great Awakening wasn't confined just to Northerners and an influence in the North. Second Great Awakening was this concussive and far-reaching religious revival that made its way to the South as well and touched the lives of enslaved people, and in doing so really urged them to express their humanity, their identity, and make claims to freedom over their very souls, their very salvations, because the Second Great Awakening had at its heart 2 key concepts, 2 central tenets. First central tenet of the Second Great Awakening is God is knowable. God is not a mystery. God is not opaque. God is knowable to all. You don't need a college degree. You don't need to even be literate. You don't need to master biblical languages or immerse yourself in biblical scholarship. Anyone can know God directly. God is knowable. God is understandable. All you have to do is open your heart to God, and God will reveal himself. Well, that idea at the heart of the Second Great Awakening was particularly appealing to enslaved people who were forbidden to learn to read and write. Here was a message that they could know God, that God had a message for them, that God would reveal himself. The other tenet, the other value of the Second Great Awakening was free will. Once you know God, because God is knowable, once you know what God demands, it's up to you to use your free will to determine your salvation. You could choose to sin and be condemned to a miserable life here on earth and hell and damnation in the next life, or you could choose to do the godly, righteous thing in accordance with God's demands and live a better life here on earth and ensure salvation in the next life. Well, that too had very particular appeal to enslaved people who felt they had no power over their lives. Here was a message that they could know God, understand God, that God had a message for them, and a message that they could exercise their free will in a way that improved their lives here on earth and ensured salvation. You might be a slave in this life. You may suffer, but if you use your free will, refrain from sin, honor God, you could determine how you will spend eternity. So the Second Great Awakening, this moment of great religious enthusiasm, and its core arguments and tenets had great appeal to enslaved people, and they eagerly gravitated to a religious orientation, as so many Americans did in this period. And in doing so, they came to think of themselves as human beings with souls, subjectivities, able to know God but also be accountable to God. They imagined themselves as having some modicum, some limited element of free will in their lives, even though they were enslaved and had no control over their lives. So when enslaved people embraced religion, when enslaved people became religiously enthused and excited based on the Second Great Awakening, it was a way of, again, expressing their identity, their humanity, and in doing so resisting the core of chattel slavery, the core of the slave society. It was a way of saying, I am a human being. I am a child of God. And that itself is an act of resistance against slavery and its core conceits that deny the humanity of enslaved people, and a way of revealing one's values. When they saw themselves as having some free will that could not determine their fate here on earth, again, you're a slave and you'll die a slave, but determine something much more consequential, eternity, it again granted to enslaved people a sense of freedom, albeit limited, over that very intimate element of their lives, their very souls. The image we have here in this lithograph is very, very true to religious practices in the slave South. If you were a plantation owner, you didn't go to church every Sunday because the closest church may be hundreds of miles away. There was a church on the premises. Every plantation had its own church on the premises, and sometimes on Sunday morning, the person leading that sermon, that service, was an enslaved person, as you see here in this lithograph, where a black man is standing up and explaining God to his white master. Talk about an inversion of the power dynamics of slavery. Talk about granting a very limited amount of control and command to an enslaved person where they are in this position of explaining God to their white master. Now, many masters often encouraged their slaves to embrace this religiosity because they saw it as a source of social control. They believed that if they exposed their slaves to the Bible, it will make their slaves less likely to resist, less likely to rebel, more obedient, more tractable. Again, the Bible is full of admonitions that tell you how to treat your slave, and slaveholders always cited that as evidence that God accepted slavery. So they believe that if their slaves learn to read and write and read the Bible, they'll see that God's cool with slavery, that God sanctions slavery. So this was one way in which masters believed that if their slaves embraced religiosity, it would make them less likely to rebel. Paternalism was this idea of caring for your dependents, and many slave owners could inflate that sense of themselves as good paternal figures by this religious instruction. So when they encouraged their slaves to seek out religious instruction, it was almost as if they were saying, well, look, we are caring for our slaves. And then finally, it could also be imagined as a source of social control, because the Bible says when someone slaps you on the cheek, you offer another cheek and say, hit me again, and that could encourage slaves to accept the beatings, the violence, the rapes that were part of the slave system. So what we see in the avid embrace of religiosity among enslaved people is, again, their claim to humanity and defiance of chattel slavery, their claim to some modicum of freedom, but it was often actively encouraged by slave owners who wanted their slaves to be more obedient, but it often had the opposite effect. When slaves learned to read the Bible, it often inspired rebellion, not obedience. Many enslaved people were drawn to the book of Exodus, the entire book in the Bible, about a slave rebellion, where God's chosen people, the enslaved Israelites, rise up in rebellion against the Pharaoh and make their way to freedom and the promised land. So sometimes when slaves learned to read the Bible, it made them more likely to rebel, despite the intentions of their owners. But what we have here in the slide is a good discussion of, again, the role of religion in the lives of enslaved people, and how religion and being drawn to, in particular, the core values of the Second Great Awakening, a knowable God and free will, allowed enslaved people to assert their identity, their humanity, how they too were part of the slave society, where who they are, what they value, and what it means to be free was deeply informed by slavery. In this case, they came to understand themselves as children of God with souls, subjectivities, an element of free will, through religion making it a key aspect of slave resistance as well as an element of their experience in the slave society. Now, I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of enslaved people do not grab farm equipment and hack to death every white person they encounter or run away. And that's simply because there was such institutional power in the South dedicated to preventing slave rebellions, preventing slave resistance. As we've mentioned throughout this lecture, every white person in the South is dedicated to maintaining slavery, even if they do not own slaves. When slaves did run away, non-slaveholding whites got on horseback and hunted them down. And that helps explain why slave rebellions are so rare. It's not because enslaved people accepted their fate. Sorry, Kanye, it wasn't a choice, right? The point we're making here again, and will throughout this class, is that the history of slavery is the history of slave resistance. Wherever slavery existed from 1619 through 1865, enslaved people resisted. But we're also making the point here in this lecture that that form of resistance is often harder to see. It's in family life. It's in slave religiosity. And another key point along these lines is that there are so few slave rebellions in American history, not because enslaved people accepted their enslavement, quite the opposite. They resisted, and resisted in a variety of ways, sometimes in very overt ways. But resisting in those overt ways was a suicide mission. You will be caught, you will be beaten, punished, and perhaps killed. There's such institutional power. Slavery is so important, so profitable. It so defines values and culture. All whites in the South were dedicated to policing slavery. And again, during the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of white men will fight and die to preserve slavery. And so that's why slave rebellions are so rare. We like to imagine that if you were transported back in time to the 1840s, we like to imagine that if you were ever a slave, you'd be fighting against slavery constantly. No chains will hold me. We all like to imagine we'd be Django, right? Kicking white ass constantly, right? But guess what? Likely you would not, because again, it was so likely to engender blowback, so likely to end in great violence falling upon those who rebelled. Instead, we get family life, we get religiosity as forms of resistance, we get day-to-day resistance, acts of silent sabotage where enslaved people would break farm equipment. That was a great strategy of slaves. They'd purposely break the plow or some other farm equipment and say, oh, well, it can't work today, right? This is a strategy of people with shitty jobs everywhere, right? If you have a shitty job, you find ways to avoid doing that shitty job, right? For example, you may go months without wanting to have a milkshake. And then one day, for whatever reason, you wake up and you're just craving, you're just jonesing for a milkshake. And on that one random day where you've decided today's the day I'm going to buy a milkshake, when you motor into the drive-thru and you order your shake, on that day, what do they invariably say back to you through that speaker? Sorry, the shake machine's broken today. And you know they broke that goddamn thing because they don't want to make you a shake, right? If you have a shitty job, you find ways to avoid doing that shitty job. Go to Walmart and try to find anyone who's going to help you, right? Those guys with the blue vests, as soon as you come in, they run away from you, right? We all know this, right? And there's no shittier job in human history than being a slave. And so they resisted through breaking farm equipment. They would pretend to be sick, right? Feign illness, right? This is what you did to get out of going to school, right? Oh, I got a stomach ache, right? And again, that doesn't change your status. You're still a slave, but for that one day where you get one over on the boss, you convince him that you're too sick and you don't have to work, well, you feel a little bit more, again, free, at least for a few moments, a few hours. Now, again, the history of slavery is the history of slave resistance. And throughout that form of resistance, slaves did run away. It was very dangerous. It was not likely to succeed, but it remained a constant through the history of slavery. In some cases, when slaves ran away and made their way to northern states, they became pivotal and consequential figures in American history. The best example of that, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave sometime in the early 1800s. We don't know when he was born because in the chattel slavery mentality, the birth date of a slave isn't important. They're not human beings. So his birth date was never recorded. Because of that, he got to decide his own birthday. He got to pick one, and he picked February 14th as his birthday, Valentine's Day. And that's why, in part, we celebrate Black History Month in February, because it was the selected birth date of Frederick Douglass. So he was born sometime in the early 1800s. In the 1830s, he ran away, made his way to the North, and then spent the rest of his life as an advocate for first ending slavery prior to the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, an advocate for universal freedom. He was an advocate for civil rights for African Americans after slavery in the 1860s and 1870s. He was an advocate for feminism. He believed women should be able to vote, not just African American men. Frederick Douglass is a remarkable human being. A recent biography of him by the great historian David Blight has won the Pulitzer Prize. And in that book, Blight argues that Douglass is the indispensable American of the 1800s, meaning there is no America as we know it without him, because his story is our story. He was born into slavery. He escaped from slavery. He demanded his freedom. And then for the rest of his life, he articulated what America should at least be about: universal freedom for all. You know, you get Lincoln's birthday off. We got George Washington and Thomas Jefferson on the currency. But unfortunately, the Americans from our past who have been the most committed to freedom are often not as recognized. Douglass is arguably that indispensable American because he was the one who really urged America to finally live up to its values. So we're talking about a human being who was born into the anonymity of slavery, who then becomes this pivotal and key, crucial figure in American history. Sojourner Truth, also a woman born into slavery, escaped from slavery, spent the rest of her life as an advocate for abolition, ending slavery, and feminism. So sometimes enslaved people who ran away became crucial, vital figures in our shared past. They would head to cities on ships and try to, again, assume new identities as free black men or women. They relied on a network of safe houses among abolitionists who were willing to break the law and give safe harbor to runaway slaves. A network of safe houses known as the Underground Railroad that allowed slaves to make their way to the North or eventually to Canada, where they hoped to live as free people. The story of Native Americans and the story of runaway slaves is a fascinating one. Sometimes runaway slaves would make their way to Native American communities and be adopted into Native American tribes as equal members of that tribe. It's a fascinating story of two maligned, hated people forced together in many ways. The Native Americans are being pushed off their land through westward expansion. They continue to be subject to wars of aggression. They saw their populations diminishing, and yet they welcomed these runaway slaves into their communities. But sometimes Native Americans who lost their land in this period of westward expansion and wars of aggression turned to hunting down runaway slaves as their only form of subsistence. And that too is a big part of American history when you pit two poor, maligned people against each other. There were sometimes uprisings on slave ships. Now, I noted that again in 1803, we banned the Atlantic slave trade. After 1803, no slaves would be directly imported from Africa. There are some exceptions, but by and large that ends. But Spain still was importing slaves from Africa, and aboard a Spanish ship in 1839, a Spanish ship known as the Amistad, there was a slave uprising. Now, many Americans are aware of this thanks to Steven Spielberg, who made a movie about it. So if you haven't seen the film, you should see it. It's pretty good, compelling, and mostly historically accurate. And so some of you may be familiar with Amistad, the story of the Amistad from that film, because that's how Americans learn history, from Steven Spielberg. The Amistad was a Spanish ship, as its name indicates. Spain, as we talked about in a very early lecture, absolutely enslaved Africans. They just didn't bring them to Mexico. They brought them to their possessions in the Caribbean, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands. Well, aboard a Spanish ship, the Amistad in 1839, the slaves aboard that ship rose up in rebellion, slaughtered the crew, took control of the Amistad, and sailed it far away from the Caribbean. And they sailed it as far north as Long Island, New York, all the way up the Atlantic coast, all the way to New York. The ship was intercepted. therefore, in American waters, and as a result, their fate would be adjudicated in American courts, and eventually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And a former president, John Quincy Adams, argued for their freedom, and the Supreme Court agreed and granted these men their freedom. They returned to Africa and never spent the rest of their lives as slaves. It was a very successful rebellion, and one that's key to American history, because ultimately the fate of the Amistad was settled in the United States as the ship was intercepted in American waters. That fate of the Amistad and the men aboard that ship who successfully rebelled spread throughout America, and it inspired another uprising aboard an American ship, the Creole. Yes, we banned the Atlantic slave trade in 1803, but there was still, as I've noted in this lecture, an internal slave trade where slaves were being sold from one state to another. That was still legal and will remain legal up until the Civil War. Aboard the Creole, a ship that was sailing for New Orleans, American slaves who learned about the Amistad, were inspired by the Amistad, rose up in rebellion, slaughtered the crew of that ship, and then sailed the Creole into a part of the Caribbean that was controlled by the British, a British possession in the Caribbean. Great Britain had already, prior to 1841, abolished slavery. Slavery was not part of the British Empire, and so the British granted these slaves their freedom, and they lived the rest of their lives in that British colony as free men. So, some pretty dramatic examples of resistance, and what these examples, whether it's Douglass or the Amistad or the Creole, represent people who are determined to be free and sometimes take such dramatic actions. But I've saved for you the most... All right, let's conclude this lecture, the survey of the antebellum South as a slave society, and conclude this final section in regards to slave resistance and the ways in which enslaved people came to express their identity despite the dehumanizing force of slavery, with the most important slave rebellion in the antebellum period, the rebellion sparked by Nat Turner. Nat Turner was born into slavery in 1800. He, like so many Americans, black or white, became religiously enthused and excited during that Second Great Awakening. He learned to read the Bible and was drawn not to the book of Exodus, but instead the book of Revelation, the book that prophesizes the end of the world, the final apocalyptic battle between good and evil. And Nat Turner became convinced that that story in the book of Revelation was the story of a slave rebellion. He believed that there is no greater evil, no greater proof that Satan is real, that the devil exists, than the existence of slavery. It is the ultimate example of Satan's hand here on earth of evil. And therefore, any blow against slavery was a blow in favor of God in the cause of righteousness. And so he became convinced that he was chosen by God, an apostle of God here on earth, who could spark that final apocalyptic battle, bring about the divine judgment of God by targeting the evil of slavery. So in these final slides, we've been talking a lot about how enslaved people came to imagine themselves as, to some extent, in charge of their lives, exerting some command, some control, some freedom over their lives, despite the inhumane unfreedom of slavery. Well, with Nat Turner, you have a very bald example of that, where this human being, Nat Turner, though born into slavery and unfree, imagined that he had the free will, he had the power to spark the end of the world, that he had been chosen by God to play this role in sparking that final apocalyptic battle prophesied in the book of Revelation. In August of 1831, he put his plan into action. He freed slaves throughout Southampton County, Virginia, and created an army of freed slaves, an army of the righteous who were about to put in motion Nat Turner's plan. Eventually, their group swelled in the size of over 80 slaves, and they hacked to death every white person they encountered, including small children, as Nat Turner and his followers saw all of them as guilty of this sin of slavery, all of them culpable in this evil of slavery, all of them agents of Satan. But, like we've also talked about throughout these final slides, such dramatic actions were bound to spark a reprisal and a backlash. And after Nat Turner launched his rebellion, and though it was immediately successful in freeing slaves, in attacking whites, eventually a local militia was called out, Nat Turner was captured, and soon executed. Reportedly, we don't have very good sources here, and whatever sources exist are suspect. There's our lesson again about historiography and what we can know and what we cannot know. But reportedly, the last words of Nat Turner as he went to his death, as he went to his execution in a very calm and serene, Christ-like way, his last words reportedly were, "Was not Christ crucified?" One last time, punctuating Nat Turner's understanding of himself as an apostle of God, a man chosen by God to do this righteous effort against the evil of slavery. Now you see that date there on the slide, and you scribble it down in your notes because, I don't know, maybe some jerk will ask you about it on an exam coming soon. But other than that, it doesn't really seem to have any inherent significance. It's just a random day, August 22nd, 1831. But if Nat Turner had gone forward with his rebellion on the day that he first hoped to stage his rebellion, the date would come screaming off the screen here with significance, because Nat Turner originally planned his rebellion for July 4th, 1831. July 4th, a day synonymous with liberty, freedom, a revolution. But unfortunately for Nat Turner, he got really sick in late June, and he was worried about whether or not he could go through physically with this rebellion, and that's why he postponed it to this date in August. But now that you know the full story, you can appreciate Nat Turner and his plans for a July 4th revolution as an act in the name of freedom, despite his status as unfree. Nat Turner's rebellion is significant not only for itself, an action of an enslaved person in the name of freedom, an effort by an enslaved people to see himself as a servant of God, accountable to God. It's also important for its aftermath. In the weeks and months after this rebellion, word spread among the enslaved people who heard about Nat Turner, heard about this man who struck such a righteous blow against the evil of slavery and inspired slaves hundreds of miles away to resist, to rebel. There were all sorts of cases, reports in newspapers throughout the antebellum South in the weeks and months after Nat Turner's rebellion of insubordination, of slaves refusing to work, demanding wages. They again may not have made the dramatic step of grabbing farm equipment and hacking every white person to death, but they were inspired to resist as the legend of Nat Turner spread. The other thing that you see in the historical record in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion is widespread panic and fear among whites. Laws were passed after Nat Turner's rebellion that criminalized teaching slaves to read and write, so there wouldn't be further Nat Turners who had read the Bible and were thus inspired. There were efforts to strengthen slave patrols, to intensify bondage and rules regarding slaves, make slaves less free and less outside the purview of whites. Now every white Southerner had to fear that the slave sleeping a few yards away in the slave quarters might be the next Nat Turner and might creep into the house in the middle of the night and slit your throat. Panic, anxiety that came from how Nat Turner took that hierarchy that Southerners were so invested in and turned it upside down. In this lecture, we have talked about the economy, society, and culture of the antebellum South. We try to take a holistic, ranging examination of that slave society to include the enslaved themselves and how they too came to understand who they are, what they value, what it means to be free through being enslaved, and that is dramatically represented in Nat Turner's rebellion and its aftermath. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to the North, its economy, its culture, its society, and its arguments opposed to slavery.